Hi guys, I actually had a different video lined up for today, but with everything happening in the country right now, politically, culturally, racially, it felt, I guess, insensitive or maybe tone deaf for me to put out one of the regular videos that I put out and not even allude to this or reference it or bring it up in some way. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and it doesn't directly relate to LGBT issues, and my channel is all about LGBT issues. So, I hesitated whether I should even put a video out. But last night I was thinking about something that does actually relate to at least coverage of a certain gay issue. So I'll circle back on that later in this video. But I did want to bring this up. I did want to talk about what's happening. And I think at this point most of us have seen this video of George Floyd on the ground losing his life before our very eyes. And I think the average sane person, no matter what they believe in politically, culturally, no matter what their racial views are or the views or the perceptions on race in America, no matter what, you see that footage and you're disturbed because we saw somebody die who didn't need to die, who shouldn't have died, whose death was completely preventable. And I think we all see that, at least I hope we all see that, and see an abuse of power. We see a cop who took his authority too far. And then I think is where the conversation gets interesting, because then you have a group of people who say this was purely a racial issue. It's not just injustice or an abuse of power. This is racism at its core. And then you have another group that says this shouldn't have happened, but this has nothing to do with race. And I am pretty much as liberal as they get. I support Black Lives Matter, what it stands for. I think when people say all lives matter, they're missing the point, they're distracting from the point. Even just in the past few weeks, we've seen other incidents caught on camera that kind of led up to this point, in a sense of leading up to this point of anger and people just being like, enough is enough. We're marching in all these cities. There was Amy Cooper in Central Park who called the cops on a guy and was happy to tell the cops that he was black because she knew that there was an advantage there from her perspective in terms of the power dynamic. Then we had Ahmaud Arbery, who was just a guy going for a run, shot and killed by these two crazed white guys in a truck who thought he fit the profile of a local criminal, which, even if that was the case, that it was the criminal, it's insane to me to think that they took it upon themselves to serve justice for the community by ending his life. But anyway, I agree with all these things, and I'm on the same page. And this is where the gay thing comes in. So when I was a freshman in college, there were gay teen suicides getting profiled by the media in a row. It was like one after the other. And I remember watching people, specifically it was often white women, white straight women, especially mothers, getting outraged by this and saying, this is crazy, what can we do, why is this happening? And I remember being kind of annoyed by that, because I thought, this has been happening, this isn't a new phenomenon. It's so interesting what people are blind to because they don't hear about it on the news or see it. And gay teen suicides have always been much higher than regular teen suicides. Trans people in particular have a very high suicide rate. So none of this was new. But I think this was the first moment that I realized media outlets will focus on a certain narrative when it will increase their profit, because they see that it grabs attention. Okay, let's dig for another story like this. And it goes on and on and on. And I think this year in particular, more than ever, and I'm assuming other people, have become very, very skeptical about media and what is portrayed in the media, because we now realize so much is just spun purely for profit. It's not even just about getting the information into people. I am repulsed by Trump and the Trump administration, but it's exhausting that every single day on CNN there's a string of anti-Trump headlines as if we didn't already know these things or think these things. the corona coverage has been completely rooted in terrifying people. And I think local governments, well, certain local governments, were very responsible in tackling this head on. And I think that it was their right and their power to do this. But I now feel that the media outlets were completely irresponsible in their coverage of the pandemic. So having that lens, thinking about the gay perspective of those gay teen suicides, which was about 10 years ago, because it was my freshman year of college, I now am looking at this thinking, when I first saw the George Floyd clip, before these protests began or anything, I remember thinking, this is not a good look, this is disturbing, but I have zero context. I don't know what happened 5 minutes before. I don't know who this guy is. I don't know what crime he was trying to commit or allegedly was trying to commit. I have zero context. And that's generally how I've often felt not about the Amy Cooper thing, because that to me was very obvious and blatant racism and white privilege at its core. Not the Ahmaud Arbery clip, because that, again, to me, if nothing else, I think anybody with common sense sees that is the epitome of racial profiling and taking advantage of the I guess, privilege of racial profiling. But oftentimes with these clips of police brutality, there's zero context. It's a clickbaity clip that's sent out because it's going to get a visceral reaction from all people, no matter what they believe in. I'm also very cautious about jumping on the bandwagon for anything that leads to a mob mentality. Even if I agree with the intent, even if I think there's been an injustice, I'm always really, really uncomfortable when it comes to jumping to an emotional gut reaction and joining a crowd, literally or figuratively, to fight for that. Because when we do that as a species, I think we become more and more animalistic, and we are less likely to think critically about things. And these are very difficult conversations to have, because I'm sure somebody who's enraged by this, as they should be, would be like, how come these people, the police, get to be animalistic, but we have to be calm? And I completely agree. I'm just saying, for my own self, I don't ever like to be associated with a crowd thought, a crowd of a certain way of thinking. I like to back up, observe, and think for myself, and be very cautious and be very analytical about where my thoughts are going and where my emotions are going. So speaking of all this, last night I was listening to an interview on The Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club, you can find it on YouTube. It's basically a radio show. They mostly play R&B and hip hop music. So any kind of talk that they have, any radio talk they have, tends to revolve around figures in hip hop, and they have a lot of rappers who come on the show. But the show has become more and more political, and they had Rush Limbaugh on. I was listening last night. I guess the episode was from a few days ago, and this conversation came up, and everybody unanimously was like, this George Floyd event was police brutality, including Rush Limbaugh. But then where the divide begins, which is really interesting, is when race is brought into it. And Rush Limbaugh was like, this has nothing to do with race. This could have happened to a white person. It just happened to fit the narrative that the media are trying to portray, that this is something that's constantly happening to black people. And then the hosts of The Breakfast Club were like, this is completely a racial issue. This is purely a racial issue. If this was happening to white people, we would hear about it instantly. It wouldn't have to go viral for consequences to come into play. And so this is a very interesting conversation, because you have two sides who are completely rooted in their version of reality, and they're unwilling, both sides are unwilling to consider that maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. Based on the racism that I see and that I believe is happening in America, it's hard for me to believe that these are all just coincidences. The issue with this kind of division is that then nothing gets accomplished, because both sides think they're right. Both sides are unwilling to consider the other perspective. And if you listen to the interview, it's actually kind of a frustrating thing to listen to, because neither side is trying to educate the other side and psychologically impact them through, I guess, how do I say this? They say that when you're trying to persuade somebody or trying to educate somebody, the best way to do it is to kind of like get in their head and ease in, as opposed to be like, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about. And it was kind of that sort of conversation. The Breakfast Club hosts were really pissed that that Rush Limbaugh wasn't willing to acknowledge white supremacy and white privilege. And I felt their frustration, because I think the concept of white supremacy and white privilege are real things. But I also, I guess, admired, I don't know if that's the right word, but I admired the fact that Rush Limbaugh is saying, what if part of all this is the media pushing for this for profit? And I think this is an important conversation to have, because I believe we should always be questioning what's fed to us by politicians, by the president, by celebrities, by what media outlets say, by what your parents tell you, by what your church tells you. I think you should always be questioning it. So I don't know what the real answer is here. Based on the racism that, all you have to do is to talk to a black person in America and hear their perspective. And even if it's not their direct experience, they'll tell you about their family members, they'll tell you about their friends, and you understand that racism is very real still in America. Slavery is not something that just because legally it was changed in the books, suddenly black people are on the same level in terms of opportunities and access to things like education and access to certain privileges. These things take literally hundreds of years. It takes multiple generations to break cycles, both physically, legally, and mentally. But I'm also aware, because of the examples that I gave before, that media outlets, I'm noticing it more than ever, that they do like to repeat patterns that they know will outrage people and therefore get more clicks, more retweets. So during this interview, when they were talking about what if this happened to a white person, Rush Limbaugh was saying we wouldn't hear about it because it doesn't fit a narrative. It would just be another crime that happens in America that doesn't get talked about, like most crimes. And then the Breakfast Club hosts were like, no, it would get talked about instantly and it wouldn't have to go viral for there to be consequences. But in this conversation, right, we're talking about the unknown. We're talking about something that we don't have video footage of. We don't have specific examples on the other side to cite. So we're all just going off of hypotheticals of our own current mode of thinking that we already have. And that doesn't actually accomplish anything. I guess what I'm trying to say is police brutality is an issue regardless, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there's other incidents of police brutality that have nothing to do with race. And because I think that the way, when you see this kind of abuse of power, to me, I see, like, the focus for me is on the power dynamic and not the race. I understand why people see the race issue first, and I think that they're entitled to that, and I think we should be having these conversations, and I think there is racial injustice in this country. But it's interesting because it's kind of like the Me Too movement. I think most people now associate Me Too movement with women. Sadly, unfortunately, mostly Hollywood white female actresses. When I think of the Me Too movement, I think of power. Again, I think of a power dynamic, an inappropriate power dynamic. I am more prone to thinking that if George Floyd was wearing a suit and tie, I don't know that the same thing would have happened to him. In the same way that I feel like if a white guy was wearing a suit and tie, this probably wouldn't happen to him. But if a white guy was coming out of a trailer park, and had stains all over a wife beater and shaggy hair and disheveled, it's not that difficult for me to imagine that kind of person in this dynamic with a cop. I feel like all you have to do is watch the show Cops and you'll see that. I realize that what I'm saying might offend people, but I think we should be having these conversations. And I don't know what the answer is. When we talk about what if this happened to a white person, if we go with this mentality that there's a narrative that media outlets are trying to push, well, then my first reaction would be, if that's completely accurate, then CNN would never show it because it doesn't fit the narrative. But then I think Fox News would absolutely show it because it fits their narrative. So the fact that, as far as I know, they've never showcased police brutality towards a white person makes me think, okay, police brutality is in fact mostly, if not completely, a racial issue in America. I think the real solution is to be having these conversations, to be thinking critically, and to be listening to people who aren't like us. I think Rush Limbaugh is somebody who could really benefit from off camera, off, profit, like off media, actually talking to Black people and people of color in general, and listening to people's experiences, because in my opinion, people like Rush Limbaugh tend to think very linear according to their own experiences, their own perception of things. I mean, even in the interview, it was kind of outrageous that the hosts of the Breakfast Club were like, have you ever been thrown out of your car because a cop just figured there's no way a guy like you drives a car like this? Have you ever been held up at gunpoint? Have you, they were listing all these things that are sadly not uncommon for Black people in America. But Rush Limbaugh was like, I've had my car keyed, somebody keyed my car, and they were kind of outraged, as they should be, that he said this, because one has nothing to do with the other. Getting your car keyed is not the same thing as getting thrown out of a car by a cop. And also, presumably, Rush Limbaugh got his car keyed because people didn't like him and they saw who he was, and that doesn't mean that it's okay that they screwed with his car, but there's a difference between your perceived crappy character getting you, getting your property damaged because of that, and then having your life be risked or your safety compromised because of the color of your skin. One is behavior, one is just existence. So my point is, I think regardless, we should be having these conversations, and there needs to be an openness to other perspectives, other experiences, not just one's own perception of things. If enough Black people around us are saying, this is racism, it happens on a daily basis, I think you have to listen to that. We have to listen to that experience. But I think we should also be critical of what's fed to us by media outlets and things being fed to us without necessarily being given context. I think it's too easy to jump to a quick conclusion based on seeing a pattern of something spun and packaged to us a certain way. I'm nervous for the comments, but I want to see what you guys think, and thanks for watching.